The recipients of the Blaney Award will have demonstrated a deep commitment to fairness, the equality of all humankind, and the necessity of building solutions to world problems on a foundation of mutual trust and understanding through dialogue. The university is proud to recognize individuals who meet those criteria, and none meets it more than our recipient today, the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, formerly the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, currently the Honorary President of Oxfam and the Executive Director of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Global Initiative, amongst many, many other responsibilities. And it is now my pleasure to ask her to join me on the podium so that I can grant her the award, the Jack P. Blaney Award in Dialogue. Mary Robinson. Ladies and gentlemen, I am reading from the formal award, the citation which reads, "The Blaney Award is presented to an individual who exemplifies internationally the spirit and programs of Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. Recipients of the Blaney Award have demonstrated a deep commitment to the necessity of building solutions to world problems on a foundation of mutual trust and understanding through dialogue." In addition to this formal certificate, there is a medal granted the award winner, encased in an originally carved West Coast box, and the medal inside is inscribed to the recipient of the 2005 Jack Blaney Award, recipient of the Award for Dialogue, Mary Robinson. And it looks a little like that, too small to see, but I hope will be treasured by Mary Robinson.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to ask Mary Robinson to talk on the subject of the power of dialogue. President Robinson.
Really, I'm very moved and truly appreciative of all the events that have taken place since I arrived yesterday at midday here to Vancouver, suffered the Irish weather that you had in preparation for me, but this morning woke up to wonderful sunshine. And I think in particular in being honoured as the second recipient of the Jack Blaney Award for Dialogue, I'm very conscious of the wise words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's a good friend. I was present when he received an award, and he has received very many. And he put it beautifully, and I so identify with this. He said, "You are recognizing me because I have been lifted on the shoulders of so many." And that's the truth. You know, you recognize people like myself, and far more so Desmond Tutu, because we have been lifted on the shoulders of those we work with. Those I worked with when I was working as President of Ireland, those I worked with in the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, those I work with now, like Peggy Clark, my colleague who's with me, and my band of great colleagues who work overtime every day in Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative. So I don't take too seriously all these awards. I know that it symbolizes a willingness to recognize that it's important that people do seek to provide more vision and a more values-led approach. And I've been very happy with my visit here to Vancouver. It's my second visit. My first visit as president coincided with the Commonwealth Games and a lot of activity and events in this region, which I greatly enjoyed. And this visit has allowed me to take part in serious dialogues, which I have very much appreciated. Yesterday, in the WASC Centre for Dialogue, we engaged in a deep analysis of two difficult issues, corporate responsibility and the right to health. And I was very taken by the informed contributions to that dialogue, and I think we really had a deep and rich and informative dialogue which left us all having a greater sense of the importance of trying to encourage more corporations, particularly those in the pharmaceutical industry, but wider than that, to frame their corporate responsibility with a particular regard to the right to health. And this morning, I met with a number of leading businesswomen, and we really had a very special dialogue, I think. We discussed practical ways in which we, who have the power to make a difference, we don't quite know how far that can stretch, but we know that we can make a difference, how we can engage with and support very vulnerable women and girls in developing countries who are victims of the catastrophic pandemic of HIV and AIDS. I think we particularly focused on one telling statistic, that girls between the ages of 15 and 24 in sub-Saharan Africa are 6 times more likely to become HIV positive, to have full-blown AIDS, than their young men counterparts. That's a terrible statistic. I've met 16, 17, 18-year-olds who either know or suspect that they're HIV positive and who are wondering what to do as young women. Can they marry? Can they have children? How do they move forward? It's a terrible, terrible problem, and it's one that does need our engagement. So, as far as I'm concerned, so far, my visit to Vancouver has been about dialogue for a purpose. And that leads, I think, naturally to the theme that I had chosen for today, which is the power of dialogue. I've been very conscious of the need to build a language of understanding, to somehow carve out a bridge of language between different disciplines, between human rights advocates and economists, health experts, development workers, and so on. We actually don't necessarily share and speak the same language, and it's so important that we would do so. And I'm also conscious in addressing any audience, addressing particularly you here today, that it's not what we say that matters so much. It's what people hear. It's what you hear of what is said. And that's also a challenge. And it's also part of the power of dialogue. There's an inner ear sometimes when people hear what is more important than anything else. And let me give you an example that struck me very much about the power of dialogue in my own island of Ireland, in the context of the slow process of peace building, peacemaking in Northern Ireland. I was President of Ireland during a pre-period that was preparing for what would become a peace process that has changed the face of Northern Ireland, as those of you who've been there in recent years will verify. And one particular individual had a role to play that changed dramatically. I'm talking about Senator George Mitchell. I remember him coming to visit with my husband and myself in our official residence, Oras an Uachtaráin, the House of the President in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. I had already met him several times when he was chairman of the Senate of the United States. He had greeted me very warmly as a humble Irish senator, no idea that I might become President of Ireland, but he sort of opened the door and welcomed me to the floor of the House, as can only happen in the United States Senate, and I was both embarrassed and overwhelmed by that welcome. And we'd had quite a lot of discussion. But when he came to see me at the start of his mission, it was an economic mission. President Clinton had sent him to prepare a conference in Belfast to help those who wanted to come out of conflict into a peace mode to have a peace dividend. And he said, and after that I'll be back in the States. I'm a lawyer now, I'm working in various capacities. But little did he know that his terms of reference would change and that he would spend 3 long years in substantially Belfast and various parts of Northern Ireland, and with great success. He did broker peace. And I remember asking a young loyalist who had been involved initially more or less on the loyalist paramilitary side, but had become a peace advocate and had been working with young people in Protestant loyalist Belfast. And I said to him, Billy, can you explain to me how George Mitchell succeeded? I mean, what was it that really made the difference? And he paused and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, President, he listened us out." He listened us out. It's a very interesting use of a verb. We ran out of steam. We ran out of excuses. He just was patient enough to listen and listen. And that's part of the power of dialogue. That's part of how you can make a difference. That you build the trust, you gain credibility because you're true to your purposes, you have integrity. And then gradually, what people are saying sounds even to them to be just excuses. And we need to get past these excuses. And what are we going to do? It's very empowering, and it's very difficult. And it takes a long and patient time. So I'll always remember that new use of a verb, he listened us out, as being a great success in the power of dialogue. I'm sometimes asked how I became interested in human rights. And I like to say, not being too serious, that it began at a very early stage, that I had a deprived childhood. I was wedged between 4 brothers, 2 older and 2 younger. So what could I do except be interested in human rights? And it somehow was also helped by parents who made it clear to me that whatever I wanted to do, I was just as entitled as my brothers. And my brothers, in fact, complained that they maybe did more domestic chores than I did, because I was the only daughter, and they felt I got a soft option there. But anyway, whatever way it worked out, I think I was lucky that I had a real sense that I could go forward and achieve what I might want to achieve. But I also recognized, as I pursued my interest in human rights, that it's not a straightforward mission, and that maybe is partly the fault of those of us who have worked in human rights. We haven't communicated as well as we should. And the reason I say that is, looking around at you today and using and saying the words human rights, I'm aware, and I think you would agree with me, that you hear those words differently. You hear them in accordance with the word pictures that come into your minds. Some of you will think of political prisoners. Some of you will think of refugees. Some of you will think of the terrible conditions in Abu Ghraib more recently. Some of you will think of countries or regions, like parts of countries like Darfur at the moment, which is very much in our minds, or China or Cuba. But you don't necessarily think, as I learned to do, in the 5 years that I spent as High Commissioner for Human Rights, working to give leadership in the UN system and to understand what we had created and what we had benefited from. And what we created and benefited from was actually a democratic process of holding governments to accountability for the promises they made when they ratified treaties. And I can vouch to you and tell you, because I have that experience, that hundreds of thousands of small NGOs on the front line of human rights in difficult circumstances are seeking to hold their governments accountable. Those who are fighting for women's rights, for child rights, combating poverty, are using this international human rights system. And it all goes back to a relatively small number of people who had a true sense of vision, a true imagination for the world, a sense that if the world had a common document in simple language that proclaimed what we had gained as human beings, that this would make a difference. And so we had the Commission on Human Rights in 1947, 1948, under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt, but with the extraordinary support and expertise of John Humphreys. And I hope you're very proud here in Canada, as I certainly am, of the contribution that he made to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But I still have to say that it's Eleanor Roosevelt who particularly inspires me, and I wonder if she's resting comfortably up there, wherever, because I constantly bring her down. I constantly invoke her to my side because she's such a valuable voice today. What she said then is so valuable now. The way that she fought her own State Department to ensure that the Universal Declaration would include a strong sense of the two parts of the human rights agenda, that it was equally important not only to uphold civil and political rights, to be free of torture, to have, obviously, right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, fair trial, etc., but also the other important part of a balanced human rights agenda, right to food and safe water and health and education and shelter. And that understanding was, to me, profoundly important when I was working in the UN system, in knowing that if you want to make progress on civil and political rights, and fair trial in developing countries, you must take seriously right to food and safe water and health and education. And then you're talking in a dialogue sense. Then you have the power of dialogue behind you. You are communicating with those that you're addressing. And I'm particularly struck by the way in which Eleanor Roosevelt, not herself a lawyer, but with a team of expert jurists from China, from the Lebanon, René Cassin, France, John Humphreys, as I mentioned, she bullied them into writing the Universal Declaration in simple language. And you recall her famous words where she said that human rights must matter in small places close to home, if they're going to matter at all. And I think we now need to take those words further. If human rights are to matter in small places close to home, then they have to matter more in international institutions, in the boardrooms of the major transnational corporations and other business, and obviously with national governments. And there are two articles of the Universal Declaration that I like to refer to because they sum it all up. We don't need all 30 articles. It's a short document, but we can really focus on two of them, and that encapsulates what we mean. The first is Article 1. Article 1 states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And I love the part that dignity comes before rights, because that rings so true with me. In my experience, if you're talking to somebody who's homeless, not just in developing countries, but here in Toronto, here in Vancouver, I'm sorry. I was thinking of Toronto in a different context. You're going to have an AIDS conference in Toronto that's very much in my mind. But here in Vancouver, if you talk to somebody who's very much invisible because they are very poor, it's that self-respect that they care about. And it's the same in the developing world. It's the same desire to have a self-worth, have a sense of self-respect. So we need in talking about human rights, to be talking both about dignity, about caring enough, about self-worth and self-respect, as well as individual rights. And we need to remember the second last article of the Universal Declaration, Article 29, which says that everyone has duties to the community, without which he or she will not reach the full development of his or her personality. A very interesting idea, a non-Western idea, in fact, an idea that is very much reflected in the Ubuntu African principles of solidarity, and in many parts of Asia, a sense of solidarity with others, link with others. It's reflected in an Irish word, which I used to use quite a bit as president, a Gaelic word. I was very conscious when I became President of Ireland of a lot of self-development around a Gaelic word called mehel. And mehel is hard to translate into English because there's no one word. You have to translate it into a phrase. It means link with neighbor. It means we are in each other's shadow. We cannot be real without the other. And this is what the Universal Declaration also says, this idea of solidarity, of connection. And so, taking all this on board at the end of my 5 years in the UN working for human rights, I felt what is needed is to make the international human rights message, the Universal Declaration and the covenants and conventions that have made it hard law in the sense that governments have ratified those conventions and bound themselves and civil society can hold them accountable, to bring this into a close dialogue with the forces of globalization, with what we mean by the various ways in which our world is globalizing and becoming different, and becoming more semi-connected but also divided by globalization. And I became aware and encouraged by the fact that by putting the words ethical and globalization together, we had struck a chord with a lot of people, particularly young people. I think we can all today identify and link with the huge crowds that have poured into Rome and that have streamed to pay their personal respects to the late Pope. Many of those who pay their respects probably disagree with the Pope, as I do, on issues of family planning and use of condoms and approach to family planning. But he gave a message of a strong moral integrity, a strong values-led need for the world to look again at where we were at the beginning of a new century. And I think it's very interesting and instructive that so many young people have heard that message. Again, I would say it's not so much what the Pope said as what people heard. They heard a message about values, and they said, yes, we do want to have a different kind of world. And so the project that we're leading, Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, is seeking to bring a strong human rights perspective and a gender perspective into areas where this wasn't really talked about before. Not because we think that's the last word, but we do think it's a vital contribution. It's a values-led contribution to the dialogue, to the debate. So in our project, which is a small project in itself, linked with the Aspen Institute in the United States, linked with Columbia University. Jeffrey Sachs is on our board. I am on the board of the Earth Institute in Columbia University. I'm also a professor of practice in Columbia. And we have a third institutional partner in Geneva, the International Council on Human Rights Policy. And we combine an ambitious sense of a vision about a more ethical globalization with a desire to be very practical, to try to make a difference in the three areas that we've tried to work in to illustrate that we can have a more values-led globalization. And as well as those three institutional partners, as was mentioned, I'm honorary president of Oxfam. We work with a whole range of other smaller partners. Indeed, we're so small that we have to partner. We can't do anything effectively on our own, so it's a very good way of doing. And we chose three areas to try and make an impact. The first of these is trade and development. And we're trying to say that even trade negotiations are not exclusively matters of trade. They can have a huge bearing on human rights in small places close to home. So in recent months, I've led two high-level delegations to two small African countries to try and illustrate this. I led a delegation in early December to Mali with a vice president of the World Bank, Jim Adams, with a senior representative of the Carter Foundation, with a representative of the Catholic bishops of the United States, and with my colleagues in Oxfam, including Ray Offenheiser, the president of Oxfam USA. We wanted to show that Mali and its neighboring countries could be competitive in cotton and could trade out of poverty in a way that would be important to them. But they are currently very strongly set back by the subsidies on cotton of the United States, subsidies of more than $3 billion a year, which go to, as I understand it, about 25,000 producers, and most of those subsidies go to 8,000 producers. So if you take $3 billion and 8,000 producers as the main beneficiaries, you're talking about major agri-business in cotton, not small producers, not small household or family producers. And yet the impact, as we saw in Mali, is very devastating. We went out into the cotton field. It's women who pick the cotton. They pick it bending down. Under the shade of a tree or half shade, we saw babies lying in a ditch. We saw toddlers. We saw older children minding the babies and toddlers, nobody in school because they couldn't afford to go to school. And this is the message we want to get across. This is human rights. This is the impact of a trade decision. And in order to be fair and to ensure that we also looked to the European Union, I led a similar delegation, this time of European parliamentarians and an organization of European and African parliamentarians together to Mozambique to look at the sugar production in Mozambique. Again, all else being equal, trade being fair, Mozambique can compete very well. It can have better sugar than Europe because it's cane sugar. And I'm talking here about beet sugar also in Ireland. So I know I'm not all that popular on this issue in my native country. But we have to be aware that we must not just look at development issues from the point of view of a kind of benevolent development approach of the rich countries towards poorer countries. We actually have to get real and adjust our trade policy in order to provide really fair trade and to provide access in fair prices to European markets and to enable countries that are competitive on price production to actually have the kind of access that they need. So this is bringing the human rights into trade. I'm not going to really spend very much time on the business links because I talked about those yesterday when we had a dialogue about corporate responsibility and health. But in my view, the business community has a huge role and responsibility. Everyone has duties to the community, and the preamble to the Universal Declaration says every organ of society must engage in making these rights more known and in realizing these rights. So as far as the human rights system is concerned, there is that responsibility. And I'm glad that some business leaders are coming forward very strongly on this, and I chair the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, 10 major corporations that are testing in practice the UN draft norms for transnational corporations. On health issues, we're looking in particular at women's health, and I discussed this morning with a wonderful group of business leaders, business women here in Vancouver, and we identified areas, I think, where we can advance the agenda, particularly in in reaching out to women in developing countries who are so vulnerable on issues of exposure to HIV and AIDS. And we looked and pondered over the terrible statistic that women between the ages of 15 and 24 are 6 times more likely to become HIV positive, to be vulnerable to the virus than their boy male counterparts. The third area that we're looking at, and it's an area that I think we really do need to think more about, is the area of migration, the sort of human face of globalization. And we weren't quite sure how we would position ourselves. And fortunately, I was appointed to serve on the Global Commission on International Migration, which will report in late August, early September to Secretary General Kofi Annan on a whole new thinking about globalization, about managing movement of people, about the fact that all human rights, all migrants, even undocumented migrants, do have a minimum core of human rights, and that we must look at the factors, the push and pull factors in migration. We must look at this in a much more humane and gender-sensitive and integrated way. And all of this, I think, leads to the reaffirmation of the power of discussion and dialogue, which is what the WASC Centre for Dialogue was created to advance. And I'd like to end my words to you today by a kind of challenge, but it's more an invitation. We need a dialogue across that kind of divide that mustn't allow the world to descend into a kind of clash of civilizations. We don't need that clash of civilizations, and we must take all necessary steps to prevent and to ensure that we're not in that kind of hinterland at all. So with a number of partners, particularly Columbia University, we've been working to develop a dialogue between women leaders, starting with women leaders in the Muslim world and in the Americas, Canada, United States, Central America, Latin America. And we're going to begin this with a high-level dialogue in September of this year, just before the General Assembly meeting, which will look at the Millennium Development Goals. And part of our thinking from the direct experience that I've been fortunate enough to have is that women in the Arab and wider Muslim world are actually doing more than has ever been the case before. More women are involved in political life, in parliamentary life, in business, in academia, and at local community level. And they need recognition. And what they're hearing a lot is that women under Islamic regimes are held back and do nothing. Now, there is Islamic extremism, which we also have to address. But actually, what is really happening is that women are really trying to be more involved. And rather than not be aware of that, we need to dialogue with and be open to their experience. And so we're planning this link between women leaders, a forum of women leaders coming from the Muslim world and the Americas, under an overarching theme of human security, because obviously in our post-9/11 world, security is a major consideration, but security also means economic security and security from a whole range of issues such as violence domestically and other issues, not just the issues associated with state security. So we have that overarching theme, and then we have 4 sub-themes. We want to look at women and their role in peacemaking and peacebuilding. We want to look at violence against women, which is a terrible problem in both developed and developing countries, as we know. We want to look at women's economic empowerment and find ways to network to support that. And we want to look at women and culture, the need for more space for women, more diversity, more understanding of these issues. So what I would like to, in a way, challenge you here in Vancouver, particularly with your Centre for Dialogue of the Simon Fraser University, is to be part of this dialogue. It's going to continue over the next 5 years, and we're going to try and deepen and broaden it and really bring home the truth that women who are doing in the different regions have much more in common than anything that would divide them. And they need to have opportunities to be open to each other, to resource each other, to link, and indeed to find that common purpose. And I think that that's really also in particular what younger people, including younger women, are looking for. They want to be inspired by a sense of value, of commitment, and also of practical ideas that make a difference. And in a way, that's what sums up for me the power of dialogue. I have a very good friend who comes from Iran. She was a former minister in the Iranian government before the revolution. She came as a refugee to this country, and to the United States. She now works in Washington, D.C., Manaz Afkami, and she has a leadership initiative that works with women in Muslim countries. And she said to me, you know, Mary, if only we could bring women together who are working in their own context and doing a lot of good and becoming more confident themselves, but who have no idea what's happening in the other regions, and indeed are confronted with very stereotyped ideas, in particular from the this part of the world, as I said, that women are not doing very much, and from the Arab part of the world, that women are entirely materialistic and not interested in values or spirituality. And both messages are completely false. They're wrong. So that's the power, to me, of real context of dialogue, of the opportunity that is presented to you here in Vancouver through the Simon Fraser University and this Maurice J. Wask Centre for Dialogue, that you can open up and provide opportunities to exchange and to really understand. And I would hope that you would link with the initiative that we're taking in September with women leaders from the Muslim world and the Americas as a start. The first way in which we really open up and listen and really hear. There's an expression that I think explains what I'm talking about, which is listen across. When you listen across, you hear what the other person has said. It's not a passive listening. It's an active understanding through listen across. And to me, that's the power of dialogue. And I do hope that in the future, there will be lots of opportunity to continue to dialogue with you, because it's been a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, President Robinson. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will agree that, especially those of you who've had the privilege of meeting and engaging with Mary Robinson on yesterday and today, that we have been variously touched and moved and stimulated, even goaded into action. And I cannot but respond to the challenge that she throws out and assure her that Simon Fraser University intends fully both to listen across the various themes that she has so well expressed here, but also to engage on the specifics. It is intriguing that her close association with Columbia University and Jeffrey Sachs on the Millennium Goals coincides with an honorary degree from Simon Fraser University to Jeffrey Sachs in our June convocations this year, and we will work with him and through him with you on that part of your agenda. And with respect to your remarks latterly about listening across the civilizations, certainly it has been a great concern for us. We are moving to build on the academic strengths in Middle East and Islamic studies at this university to create a new center for comparative study of Islamic cultures and societies. And certainly in that endeavor, we will work in practice to respond to the challenge that you throw out. Ladies and gentlemen, we have all been privileged on this occasion of the award of the Jack Blaney Award in Dialogue to be associated. The university is extremely privileged to be associated with President Mary Robinson, and on your behalf, I thank her very much this afternoon. Thank you.